Chapter 24 Entombed. She could not say where the whispering was coming from. It seemed to be at once everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of indistinct voices speaking over each other in an insidious hiss that twisted into her mind. Maybe it was coming from inside her head. Maybe it had always been there. The voices rose and fell out of the masses like waves on the sea, lurching graspingly into the light for a moment, only to be swallowed back into the fathomless shadow, unknowable and lost. But Kendra was certain that each and every one was looking directly at her, pinning her in the void, naked and displayed. There was one that stood out against the maelstrom. Each voice was turbulent and coursing with fear, remorse, bitterness, hunger, hate, paint on a palette, running together into a swirling brown morass of regrets. But amid the cacophony of writhing souls, there was a point of stillness, clearest of all in its silence. Kendra could feel him, elegant and calm, patiently awaiting something. She could feel his great shadow fall over her. She could not escape it, could not even find its edges. She was a part of it, or it was a part of her, quiet, noble, and eternal. Kendra! She opened her eyes, then reached a hand up to be sure that her lids were indeed moving. There had been no change in the complete darkness. She was at least aware of herself, for good or ill. Her body was bruised and aching, prostrated against piles of rough, icy stones. And the whispering had faded into an almost undetectable murmur on the bare edge of her consciousness. She turned to a spot of warmth against her skin in the dark, a familiar hand on her arm, shaking her with pointed claws carefully pulled back to a safe angle. "Caleb?" she asked, half coughing on a throatful of dust. She heard a sigh of relief. "You were muttering to yourself," he said, his voice shaken. "I suppose it's a good thing, or I'm not sure I would have ever found you. I can't see a blasted thing. But you sounded, well, I wasn't sure it was you at first." Kendra forced herself to laugh, brittle and wheezing. "I wasn't entirely sure I was myself either," she admitted hollowly, her thoughts coming as a hazy and disjointed jumble. Slowly, painfully, she brought herself onto one elbow and tried to focus. "How long was I out?" "Oh, I'm not entirely sure of that either. I woke up with a nasty lump on my head, and I think I was thrown a fair way. But I'm sure of one thing. We're not getting out the way we came. That big pile of rocks you're on, that's where the entrance was. As near as I can tell, it's entirely caved in." His voice was steady and reserved, but Kendra picked out of the darkness 2 spots of red, agitated and worried. "And I haven't been able to find Maya," he added quietly. Kendra rose sharply, but the movement made her head swim dizzily. She gritted her teeth, eyes watering, a hand to her forehead. "Is she trapped under the rubble?" she asked, her heart pounding in her ears. She began to feel around for something, anything that might give a sign. "Did I lead her to her death too?" Caleb's hand came firmly over hers, holding her in place. "This whole tunnel is unstable. I already tried to sift through it, and it just made more rocks fall. If you try to dig around in the debris, there's a good odds you'll bring the whole cave down on us." "We can't just sit here and do nothing." Her voice was a strangled cry, but she did not fight him. She sat, the powerless impotence pressing in on her as if it were her caught beneath the weight of the rock slide. "There's nothing we can do for her," Caleb said, shaky but insistent. We won't be much help to anyone if we get ourselves killed in the process. And we don't know that she's buried. She might just be cut off from us in the cave-in. If any one of us can handle ourselves underground, it's her." Kendra knuckled at her forehead, trying to force a semblance of calm into her panicked mind. "Then what do we do?" she croaked, her throat contracting tightly. She felt childish asking, but in truth she could hardly think, her mind locked with crossing worries. There were several moments of silence before Caleb responded. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to find another way out. Maya said that the hill was full of empty spaces. Maybe somewhere in here a tunnel leads to the outside. It's worth a try, and I think we'd better move along regardless. I don't like being in the last place that thing saw us." That brought a renewed chill down Kendra's spine. In her worry over Maya, she'd quite forgotten the last thing she'd seen before darkness descended on her. She looked around in blind futility, her stomach plunging. The thought of it looking for her even now, stalking the black tunnels with its hollow smile and dead eyes, was almost more than she could bear. "Well, if it's following us, at least it won't be looking for Maya," she muttered nervously. She heard a sigh, but Caleb offered no further comment. "Come on. I think I found a relatively large passage while you were out. It seems to go on for a fair distance. It's a place to start, at least." His soft footsteps began to pad away, echoing strangely. She stood paralyzed for a moment, before speaking up hurriedly. "Caleb." The footsteps paused, and she fought the humiliation of her request. "You really are no better than a child," she thought dully. But there was nothing for it. "I can't see anything. I don't want us to get separated. Would it be all right if you held my hand while you're leading?" There was another long moment of silence. Then she flinched as something nudged against her arm. It was a moment longer before she realized it was his proffered hand. Swallowing her embarrassment, she took it. His claws had been tucked carefully into his palm. As her mind churned with unseen monsters, it was a small comfort. His touch was a welcome point of heat and softness in the frozen darkness of the stony passageway. "Thank you," she said smallly. He did not reply, but she felt his fist tighten under her grasp before deliberately relaxing. Wordlessly, he led her on into the starless night beneath the hill. As it turned out, there was little chance of them losing each other in the dark. The tunnel was formed of great fallen blocks and narrowed severely down to a cramped gap. Often they had to squeeze through tight points or clamber up steep surfaces, and soon Kendra was covered in a cold sweat. It was slow and difficult work, but the worst part of it was the time that it gave her to think. Her head had cleared, and the thoughts that she was left with were as bleak and grim as her surroundings. Moira was dead. For 2 days she'd chased the woman, hoping against hope that she might yet set things right, only to arrive too late. Worse still, her single-minded pursuit had led them directly into a trap. Now Maya was alone and missing, maybe hurt or worse. Caleb running blind in the dark, and it was all for nothing. All her fault. But perhaps worst of all was that shame was not chief among her broodings. More and more it was overshadowed by a pure animal dread. Despite all the guilt to be laid across her shoulders, what pressed on her worst of all was that sense of being hunted. Even now she could almost feel the eyes of the face-stealer on her, a rat in a maze. It was a fear that shrank her, mindless as a fleeing quarry of an implacable predator. She could hardly spare a thought for her failures, for her friend's deadly peril that she was unmistakably responsible for. Kendra was laid bare, a selfish knot of animal fear scarcely holding together, and by her estimation, that was what left her truly pitiable and utterly small. And as they walked silently through the blackness, the whispering began to rise around her. She gripped hard down on the iron pommel of Moira's blade, feeling its dreadful sting. That pain was a welcome distraction, and not half the pain she deserved. She was shaken from her darkly spiraling thoughts when Caleb came suddenly to a stop. "There's a little water left," he murmured, flat and stoic. He was still readily audible. Everything echoed disturbingly on the hard surfaces of that silent place, even the lowest whisper. She managed to smile, but could feel its forced and unnatural tug. So much the better that no one could see it, she supposed. "Thank you," she replied roughly, only now noticing how desperately dry her throat had become. Kendra drank gratefully, careful not to waste even a drop, and stopped before her thirst was quenched. She prodded him with the water skin. "You have some too, all right?" "I'm fine," he said, with a little snort. "Elves don't need—" He faded back to the brooding silence that had characterized his demeanor since the morning. She could no longer feel the slashes on her cheek. Doubtless they were completely gone by now, as strange as that was to consider. She smiled encouragingly, forgetting for another moment that he could not see the expression. "Elves don't, what? Need to drink water? I've never heard any such thing. Are you serious?" Her voice was light and inviting in a way that did not touch her heart. The darkness within and without was so heavy, like she was drowning in tar. That hand in hers was the only lifeline, and even it felt vanishingly thin, as if he were hardly there at all. She waited, half holding her breath. But Caleb remained quiet for a few moments before pulling her on. "It doesn't matter," he muttered harshly. "I shouldn't prattle on." He tried to move, but Kendra dug in her heels. "What do you—" he began to ask, sullen, when he stopped. Kendra had pressed his knuckles to her cheek. The skin was smooth and perfect there, with no sign of any injury. It was a bitter contrast to the other side, mottled and scarred, but even that was of little consequence to her then. She held it there, even as he pulled against her. "Caleb," she said, her voice shaking, "I'm not hurt. It was a mistake. I know that. So would you just talk to me like things are normal? That would be nice. Please." He pulled his hand back hard, and this time Kendra let it go. She could hear him pacing nearby, agitated, and that faint burn of his eyes in the darkness grew more prominent, laying vanishing streaks of fire across the blackness. "Just because a sin doesn't have a lasting consequence doesn't erase it," he finally growled. His voice was tight with things unsaid, roiling currents behind his eyes. "You can't just forget about these things because they're inconvenient. I can't allow myself to forget them." "I forgive you!" Kendra cried, too loud. It echoed in the passage, and Caleb hissed in protest, but she didn't much care. His attitude would have been exasperating if she weren't so desperate. "I forgive you, so give it a rest." "Fortunately," he said coolly, "I don't forgive myself so easily." "Well, don't make that my problem," she exclaimed. "Right now, it's dark, and we're being hunted, and I got Moira killed, and maybe Maya too. I know what it's like to have made a mistake and hurt someone." She could feel him beginning to object, but she overrode him. "I'm scared, Caleb, all right? I'm terrified, and I only have you. So please, right now, can you take a break from torturing yourself and just talk to me?" "I told you I would protect you," he said, voice so awfully tired. "I told you I will get you out of this place, and you're in worse trouble than ever. You trusted me, and I attacked you like a mad dog. Honor matters, even if I'm the only one that knows it. I can't just let this go forgotten, Kendra. Saying I'm sorry, that doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change what I've done." "It doesn't," she said quietly. She heard his breath intake, sharp and painful. "But," she forestalled him, "neither does this. Nothing is going to make it better. But moving on, Caleb. Whatever ideas you have about honor and justice, they're not doing anything for me. So say you're sorry, and talk to me, and we'll go from there." Caleb didn't say anything for a long time, but Kendra waited for him, her heart in her throat. She watched as his eyes passed from red to crimson that barely registered against the lightless tunnel. Finally, his throat raw, she heard him mumble, "I'm sorry. Truly I am." She nodded, and then pulled him into a hug he could not have seen coming. She could feel the wet spots press against her shoulder. "Okay," she said, low and a touch roughly herself. "Thank you." With a clap on the shoulder, she set him back on his course, wearing a smile that was feeble but real. "So, elves don't drink water, huh?" He gave a familiar and long-suffering sigh that was the most welcome sound in the world. "Of course elves drink water," he retorted, shaky, but beginning to step into his pedantic stride. "We simply have a vastly more efficient metabolism than humans do. An elf at rest can seem almost comatose. There's a rather famous example of one Marius of the now defunct House of Red Page, who, for 3 days and nights, lay presumed dead in the deepest cells of the Fairy Queen Ayara." The current of time slowed, leaving them spinning becalmed along the axis of their sunless voyage for what might have been minutes or hours or days, for all Kendra could say. She knew that she had gone from hungry to very hungry, and her fatigue grew ever harder to ignore as they fumbled their way down the twisted tunnels. But the blackest thoughts were kept at bay by Caleb's stories. His tone was largely dry and professorial, but often with a prompting question, he would spiral off into thoughtful digressions, considerations of things past that waxed now mournful and then joyful, and often both at once. Kendra could not fully express the blessing that they were, those words that floated around her like buoys in that ocean of dark. They almost let her block out the whispering, even as its ever-present hum rose steadily at the back of her mind. She might have been spared even longer, had Caleb not stopped, suddenly silent, 2 pinpricks of red turning round urgently in the darkness. Kendra's hair stood on end as he stared, then whispered, "Do you hear that?" It was then that they saw a light. It was pale and ephemeral, but it may as well have been a star unveiled before their eyes, attuned as they had been to the pitch dark. The passage was cast in sharp relief, the walls peculiarly pristine, and covered with a tapestry of innumerable carved likenesses. The portraits were striking, but Kendra could pay them little mind now. They had been walking down a straight corridor, but now it turned sharply. The light reflected around a corner. It had an uneasy familiarity. It might have been the twin to the last light she had seen, the indistinct nimbus that had curled around Moira's insubstantial form, as if Kendra had not moved a step. "Ghosts," she murmured, too weary to feel ridiculous. "We should leave," Caleb whispered, voice taut. "Let's backtrack and find a different route. The cavern ahead must be full of them." "No," Kendra said vaguely, her brow wrinkled. She ignored his bewildered look, concentrating intensely, the ears atop her head stirring of their own accord. They were difficult to hear, and harder still to distinguish, but as she listened, she got an unmistakable impression. "I don't think they're dangerous," she said slowly. "It doesn't feel hostile or frightening. There's just a lot of, well, a yearning?" He was wearing a truly truculent look, but she held up her hands placatingly. "Look, please, trust me. I think we should keep going. Besides, anyone or anything we think might be ahead of us has got to be a lot better than what we know is behind us." After a certain amount of irate muttering, he nodded. "Stay behind me," he said, resigned. "And if I say we go, even if I have to sling you over my shoulders." And so, with great care, they walked on into that otherworldly light. As they approached, there was a strange wailing sound that came reverberating, not from ahead, but from behind. They had done little more than freeze in place when it was upon them. Great gales of wind came suddenly at their back, strong enough to take them both off their feet. There was a sensation like falling through a veil of mist as she tumbled wildly to the ground. She caught herself nimbly enough, at least until Caleb fell over her with a weighty thump. For all his graceful movements, the elf was tall, muscular, and quite heavy. She groaned, blinking dazedly. She had rather cracked her knee going down, and it throbbed painfully. "Thanks for that," she grunted, more than a little ill-humored. "Now would you mind getting off me?" "Caleb?" But he did not respond. Perplexed, she looked up, and her jaw dropped. Caleb had not moved from where he had landed across her back. He was staring upwards, rigid and unbreathing, and she could hardly blame him for it. They were at the center of a circle of light, dazzling after the darkness of the caverns, swirling around them disorientingly. At first, Kendra thought that it was a band of cavalrymen, more than a dozen of them. They were indistinct and flowed together as if they were moving at great speed, but as near as Kendra could tell, they were hardly moving at all. As her eyes acclimated, the realization struck her. They were not horsemen. These were centaur. Understanding dawned, and she returned her attention to Caleb. "Are these your—" She stopped short. Her friend's eyes were awash with tears. "Meisha," he murmured as if in a trance. "Christoph, Arya, Zora, Misha. Kaya and Cheney, Morden, Xander, Caden, Tristan, Garen, Nora, Damien and Sarah, Fenna, and Aurora." She could feel him over her, his breathing ragged, the beat of his heart almost palpable against her skin. "You're all here, all of you." "It's gratifying to be remembered," said a voice, distant as Moira's had been, but with a distinct note of gruff amusement. "It took you weeks to remember my name, as I recall. I'm glad it finally stuck." "Oh, pipe down, Tristan," came a second voice, calm and dry. "It certainly isn't his fault that you're so utterly forgettable." "It's hardly the time for all that, you two." The voice was feminine and stern as a birch rod. "We don't know how long we have, so restrain yourselves. Caleb, my dear boy, it's so good to see you. Please, dry your eyes." "Nora," Caleb breathed faintly. He brought himself to a sitting position, pulling his weight off Kendra hurriedly as he rubbed his face, raw and discomposed. "I'm so sorry. I'd always hoped that you all would move on and not get caught here. You've already been through so much." "Oh, it isn't as bad as all that," echoed the voice of Tristan. "Our people were always nomadic. A little more wandering won't hurt us. Besides, our time wasn't quite over yet. There was still a member of our herd roaming the garden. It would shame us to leave anyone behind." Caleb gasped. "You aren't the last centaurs? I was certain that—" He paused as a ghostly chuckling began to reverberate around them. Even Kendra had to hide her smile in spite of herself. "What?" he asked, bemused. "I think they're talking about you, Caleb," Kendra replied gently. A small "oh" came to his lips, but for a moment Caleb had no words. "Oh, Caleb," came a faraway sing-song voice, juvenile and bright. "You were always so smart and thought so much that sometimes you missed the obvious." A smaller figure in the ring broke ranks with the others and drew near. Passing out of the broader glow, Kendra could make out some of the features of the centaur. Lean and lanky, with a surpassingly large grin plastered across his timelessly young face. His hand trembled as if he wanted to reach out to touch Caleb, but he held himself in check. "I'm glad you started a new tribe," he whispered tenderly, his legs folding under him to drop down to Caleb's level. His face was twisted and pained now as he cast his gaze around the circle. "It's kind of you to say it," he said thickly, "but I don't deserve all that. In the end, I broke my word. I said I'd save you, and in the end I couldn't do anything. I let you down." There was renewed laughter from the crowd. "To let us down, we'd have had to expect something," came the raucous voice of Tristan. Caleb looked hurt, but the centaurs paid him no mind. "I wanted to make things right," Caleb cried with a hint of frustration. "I was so close to saving you all, and I couldn't do it." "Caleb," Nora said patiently, "we never expected you to save us. You always were a sweet boy, but sometimes you're too wrapped up in your grand ideas to see the world for what it is. What more could you have done, really? What more was possible?" She waited, but Caleb said nothing. "You aren't all-powerful," she continued with a smile. "We were set on our path long before we met you, by our choices, by the choices of our foremothers, by the turning of the world. That you didn't hold back the tides or stop the sun from rising is no mark against your honor, so don't be such a mule about it." "You were there for me at the end," murmured the little one that kneeled before them. "You held me when I was hurting. Because of you, I wasn't so scared to pass over." Caleb watched, drained. "It wasn't enough, Misha," he said, quiet and sorrowful. Yes, it was, Misha replied simply. Rise, Caleb. And Nora's voice came so strong and demandingly vital that Kendra could have sworn that the living woman stood there beside them. You are the last of the Skyhard, our sole remaining clansman. Rise and be proud. Beside her, Caleb took a long breath before standing. He seemed taller somehow, and there was a look in his dark eyes that she'd never seen there before. Wiping the tears from his face, he seemed as strong as he did vulnerable. Then he sighed. All right, he said in an ungracious tone that did not match his little half-smile. I take your point. He looked down at his boots, kicking at a pebble. Thank you, he said to his feet. There was some clamoring and cheering as the herd began to move around them. We don't have much time, said Nora, now businesslike and to the point. This is taking everything we have left, and we will only be able to manifest ourselves for a little while longer. What do you need, Caleb? Me and my friend are trying to get out of here as quickly as possible, Caleb explained quickly. The central shaft leading down from the hill collapsed, and we believe we're being pursued. We need to put distance between us and it, fast. We have another companion, Kendra interjected hastily. We lost her in the cave-in, a dwarf by the name of Maya. Have you seen her, maybe? The centaurs blinked and stamped, as if just taking notice of her. A dwarf? Called one of the voices in amusement. You always did keep some old company, said another with a grin. Say, that girl there, she wouldn't be a... It would take too long to explain, Zora, Caleb said firmly. Have you seen the dwarf? Perhaps back the way we came some distance? There was a stillness among them as the group turned as one, as if listening for some tremulous subterranean echo. When they stopped, there was troubled muttering. There's a few things moving down here, apart from the two of you, observed an older-looking centaur, so far as the ghostly figures could seem to have any age at all. It would seem that things have gotten quite stirred up, indeed. On the other side of the hill there's a gathering of sorts, a gathering of spirits. I think your friend may have attracted some interest, but it's hard to see much through all the activity. A right storm of souls. And... He hesitated, before continuing in hushed tones. Something is coming. I can see it. I mean to say, it is alone, but its shape, its essence, it's like 1,000 souls sewn together. Sister, save us. A great unease passed through the ghost herd, with much stamping and milling and pawing at the ground. Caleb nodded decisively. That's what we're running from, he said grimly. We'll take any path that takes us away from that thing, as quick as possible. Wait, cried Kendra. They said something is happening to Maya. It sounds like she's in trouble. We can't just leave her with that. And if she gets out of that, she'll still be alone with the face-stealer. She tried to say the word with confidence, even as a shiver ran through her. Caleb was looking mutinous, but Kendra glared at him. We couldn't have found her before, but now we know where she is. We have to go get her. In case you forgot, there's an immortal monster that wants your guts between her and us, Caleb retorted, unappeased. Kendra flinched, a hand flying involuntarily to her belly, but he pushed on mercilessly. What exactly do you propose we do about that? We take you around. The little centaur, Misha, she remembered, cantered forward with nervous excitement. We know all the paths down here. If we move quickly,
We could be past it before it ever got close."
Caleb's expression was thunderous, but for a wonder, he ground his teeth and held himself in check. He watched the centaur boy's expression with soft eyes, before sighing. "You're sure?" he asked, gentling himself noticeably. Misha grinned broadly and tossed Kendra a wink. Startled, she gave him an uncertain half-smile in return.
"Misha is certainly the authority when it comes to nasty, winding paths," Nora commented dryly, but with obvious affection. "To be expected, of course. He's gotten himself lost on more of them than the rest of the herd put together."
The circle chuckled, and Misha gave a demure bow.
"You can still run with a pack of centaurs, right, Elf?" the youth crowed with delight. "Haven't gone entirely soft?"
The boy's demeanor seemed to be infectious, because Caleb snorted with wry amusement. "I do all right." He turned to Kendra. "How about you? Can you keep going?" She swallowed, before trying to assume a little bit of the bravado in the room.
"Well, I've been running for 2 days, just about. What difference can a few more hours make?"
Caleb gave her a reproving glare, but unruly cheers rang all around them.
"Well, we'll drag you along behind us after you collapse," he muttered uncharitably.
"Gallant, ain't he?" called one boisterously. "A real charmer. 'Twas only a matter of time before he brought back a nice 2-legged girl to meet us."
"And we're off to find another," piped up Tristan. "Why, put them together, and you'll about have a proper woman."
This met with renewed laughter, and Caleb all but growled. For her part, Kendra flushed a little, but she couldn't suppress a smile as well. This messy, contentious warmth, it was what she'd always read family was supposed to be.
"Enough,"
said Nora, severe but not unkind.
"The hour grows late. I think our time here is near at an end now. I can feel me hold slipping. Soon we'll not have the strength enough to continue manifesting. Whatever must be done must happen now."
She extended her hand towards Caleb, ceremonial and yet with unmistakable affection.
"Caleb, shall we ride together one last time?"
There were tears again on his cheeks, but Caleb was smiling, fierce and true, his eyes almost brown. "It would be my honor." What followed was a blur for Kendra. They rode at the center of a stampede, silent but for the exuberant cries of their echoing voices. The rough caverns were now awash in their spectral light, clear and bright, each in the ghost herd a lantern against the dark. Where before they had grasped and stumbled, sightless, now Kendra and Caleb ran through the sprawling halls beneath the Hill of the Lost at breakneck speed. The passages of collapsing pillars were labyrinthine, and Kendra quickly lost track of where they had been and where they were going. But as they climbed over fallen pillars that must have been raised by giants, flew by walls intricately inscribed with forgotten tongues and faded mosaic portraits, skirted bottomless chasms of night, the exultation never left Caleb's face. He was always just ahead of her, always with a ready look of thrumming joy as he pulled her along their wild, careening course. She was breathing heavily, as she had not since her changes had begun. Even her quick feet and heightened reflexes were hard-pressed to match the endurance of Caleb and the pack. As they went on, she noticed the darkness was gradually returning. There were fewer of them on the trail now. One by one, the lights around them were going out, as the sky-herd passed on. Kendra saw Nora's pace abruptly begin to flag. She fell behind and stopped, and Kendra paused with concern,
an unspoken question on her lips. There was a look of well-being and ease in Nora's gaze as she watched Caleb charge on, almost soaring through the air as he bounded free and unstoppable down the tunnel. Her light was fading as she turned to Kendra. "I'm glad you're with him," he whispered, clear in Kendra's long, twitching ears. "You are a fine herd mate. My blessings, Kendra." Then Kendra could see her no longer. She nodded into the darkness with reverence, then redoubled her efforts. She would hate to slow him down now, and somewhere nearby, Maya was waiting. The sunless world was as timeless as ever, and Kendra could not have said how long they ran. But soon enough, the lights had grown very dim indeed. There was a nod between Caleb and one of the remaining centaurs, and they slowed and circled up. Little Misha was there, and 2 others. As the pounding of blood eased in her ears, Kendra could hear the whispering again, stronger than before. Even as she panted, she glanced around nervously. It felt as if someone was standing just behind her, hissing a stream of malevolent murmurs in her ear. Kendra shivered, cold sweat trickling down her back. "It's close now," Misha said, his usually bright expression now showing some tension. "They're all circled up around someone alive in there. You grab her as quickly as you can and go. We'll hold them off. The way out isn't far now. Just keep on going up." "Will you be all right?" Kendra asked. They seemed a small band against the blackness she could feel before them. But Misha only chuckled. "It's been a while since we got ourselves in some trouble. I think it should be a proper send-off." Caleb nodded, his eyes brimming with feeling, sorrow and joy, love and regrets. But in the end, all he said was, "Thank you for everything." He bowed to all of them, then rose with a grin. "Give them hell." He strode on towards the immense stone archway, Misha behind him, the 2 of them flanked on either side with spectral figures as their vanguard. Kendra hurried behind them, her heart pounding. Maya would be all right. She'd get her out. She had to. The chamber that they entered was dark, not at all like the luminous openness of the hall where they'd found the sky herd. But more than she could see it, Kendra felt it. They were not alone. The air thrummed with a frozen chant, one that spoke of the great shelves of stone that hung over their head, an unsteady tomb. They were in an amphitheater, with many rows of seats arrayed in rings around the rising edges of the room. They entered through a great arch, and through the gloom there was a hint of another on the far side of the circle. And at the center, a kneeling shape lay on the ground. A cry leapt to Kendra's throat, and she began to run forward. Caleb cursed and followed, calling their escort to action. At first, Kendra did not understand his command, so intent was she on Maya's slumped form, when she suddenly noticed that the whispering had gone silent. She slowed fractionally, surveying the room with a quick turn of her head, and gasped, almost stumbling. Each row of the seats was filled. Hundreds of figures encircled them now, at first nearly invisible even in the faint light of the ghost herd. There was only the barest hint of light in the watchers, and it dismally extinguished as Kendra's eyes rose to their faces. Each one was a hole in space, a point of absolute blackness that spilled over in tendrils of hungering miasma. They stood statue still, ranks of unmoving sentinels in the dark, unnerving in their familiarity. After a moment, Kendra placed that perfect stillness. It was unmistakably dwarvish in character. Her heart quailed under their sightless consideration, but she rebuked herself. They were only watching. She turned her gaze deliberately away from them and took the last few steps to Maya's side. There was something terribly wrong with her friend. She looked battered and bloodied, Kendra noted with a sinking heart, and she was huddled in on herself, childlike. But far more unsettling was that trembling. Even when confronting the face-stealer, the dwarf had not faltered. Maya was stone-made flesh, immovable and unshakable, yet now she lay quavering like a leaf. Kendra laid her hand on the dwarf's shoulder with an anxious murmur of, "Maya?" And several things happened at once. Immediately, the silent congregation began to churn, the whispering returning all at once and from all sides, buffeting them like a storm. They began to contract in on the center of the room, a closing fist, and just as quickly, the centaurs of the sky-herd struck back. Lances of light, they rode forth in each direction, pushing fearlessly into the hissing mass. In the same heartbeat as Kendra's hand touched Maya's icy cold flesh, the woman began to flail and cry out like a wounded animal. I'm sorry, she howled, her face riven with trails of tears, and the lines like chasms cut deep in her crumpled visage. I didn't mean to. I tried. Please don't say it any more. I can't hear it. Please. She looked out of her mind with an unspeakable horror that she would rather die than endure a moment longer, and she writhed and rolled like a woman possessed under Kendra's touch. Maya, it's all right. It's us. It's Kendra. She tried to make her voice reassuring, but there was a growing roar around her, as if she stood in the eye of a storm, and she nearly had to yell to be heard. Maya merely shrank away like a beaten dog. There's no time, Kendra. Grab her! Caleb's words were harsh, but glancing up, she could see he was right. The centaurs that had rode proudly against the swarm were now barely glimmers amid the seething mire of empty, gibbering faces. Go! Came a distant, desperate shout, barely audible over the din, and with a last, anguished look back, Kendra obeyed. She took Maya under one arm, Caleb taking the other, and they ran, fighting Maya for each step as she thrashed and raved. Behind them, a twinkling hand rose defiantly out of the melee, before it too was swallowed, and darkness fell. Slowly as they went on, the noises of that chamber died back down to a whisper on the edge of her mind. They seemed not to be followed, and their guides had led them true. There were few cracks and side tunnels to take them off the path, even as they edged along through the pitch black. After some time, Maya had fallen silent. She fought them no further, though she shuffled along only at their urgings, her efforts flagging whenever a hand was not pushing her on. As they ran, Kendra tried to whisper encouragement to her friend, but if Maya heard her words at all, she made no sign of it, and the twisted knot grew steadily in Kendra's gut. Suddenly, they turned a corner around a long loop of passage, and there was light. It was distant and weak, but as Kendra squinted, it resolved to a point at the end of this last rough corridor. Though still forbiddingly distant, the morning sunlight passing beyond those heavy arches made her heart leap and put renewed energy in her limbs. She could have all but danced, relief coursing through her, hot and wonderful. "That's it!" she cried in excitement. "We're almost there now, Maya. Just hold on a little while longer, and we'll be out." Her capering step found unsteady footing, and Caleb's adder-quick grasp was all that kept her standing. She swayed back from the point, looking about in confusion, and gaped. Just beyond the reach of those feeble rays, the path fell off precipitously, the shadows concealing the profound darkness of those plummeting depths. As Kendra's eyes adapted to the new light, she felt a moment of vertigo as she realized that the path ran alongside a great trench for much of the remaining span between them and escape. Against her better judgment, she nudged a pebble off the edge with a tentative toe. The tiny echoing bounces of the stone's descent went on for a long time. Caleb grimaced at the hole with obvious misgivings before he shrugged unhappily. "Switch sides with me," he said, beckoning. "I want you by the wall." She shook her head adamantly, trying to present a bravery that she did not especially feel. "Of the two of us, I'm the one with a history of surviving fatal injuries. Come on, we're almost there. Keep going." Caleb grumbled, but let it pass with the air of one picking his battles, still half pushing Maya. As they proceeded to hastily hobble down the passage, Kendra began to feel a growing hope that they really might make it out, and that this abyss would take no more from her. It was a thought that she regretted almost immediately. Soft, almost shyly, Kendra heard the crunch of a footstep on loose stones behind them. She turned, but need not have. Kendra was achingly certain of what she would see long before she ever looked. Passing out of the shadows into the pale stream of daylight was the face-stealer. The expression beneath its shock of red hair was curiously blank, but as it turned and locked eyes with her, that incomprehensible nightmare of a smile stretched across its face, all taut skin and pointed tooth. With that sound of sand slipping from its emptying hourglass, it laughed. Then it was upon them. The ground between them vanished faster than she could have believed. Flying down the tunnel, it extended its clawed hands toward them in an embrace like a maw of needles. Kendra barely had time to call out. Caleb was still turning, still half entwined with Maya, when it hit them. In a moment of panicked clarity beyond thought, Kendra met the assault with a speed that was not her own. Springing forth like water from a broken dam, she leapt up to send her knee plunging into its chest, coming momentarily eye to eye with it. It seemed hardly to notice her blow. That gaze pierced her, a butterfly on a pin, for a moment that stretched with hideous unreality. With a crash, her momentum carried her into the ceiling. She felt her nose crunch, could taste the sickly tang of blood. Before she could draw a breath, a second blow hit her. She had fallen to the ground. She wanted to curl up into a ball and weep, but terror spurred her on. Chest unbearably tight, she managed to roll and turn, gasping, eyes searching frantically. Her blow had landed as if upon a veil, immaterial, and indeed she could see that the thing had flown over them like a rag doll. At the end of its arc, it suddenly went rigid as a spider, its arms and legs stiffening and contorting unnaturally until it landed in an insectile crouch, a spindly blemish against the light beyond. It watched them, still heaving and hissing with that terrible parody of laughter, blocking their escape. Then it flung itself at them anew. Kendra tried to rise, but her limbs refused her. Though her blood ran cold and fear pounded suffocating in her breast, she could barely move. Gasping for air, she knew she would not make it. And something flashed red beside her. Caleb was up and leaping to meet the monster in an instant. He snarled with that ferocity that was nearly as terrifying as the creeping dread of the face-stealer, but from the start there was desperation in his thrashing assault. It was his third time crossing the monster, she thought despairingly, and for all his fire and fury, he had barely survived the previous. With an off-handed cuff, the face-stealer ended it. Caleb flew off his feet and skidded almost to her side, spitting blood. With a flourish of its long fingers, it strode towards them almost casually. It was a black silhouette against the light beyond, but Kendra could still feel that smile hanging over them, utterly inhuman. It continued its unconcerned approach even as Kendra clambered to her feet. "Leave us alone!" she croaked. She wanted to shout, but her lungs still heaved and wheezed. With a glance at the gaping ravine beside them, she came up with what was not really a plan. But there could be no alternative. She had brought them to this, and it was her responsibility. Before her terror could paralyze her, she lurched forward and made to tackle the abomination into that yawning void. The effort was clumsy and desperate, but the face-stealer made no attempt to evade. If anything, it seemed to pull her in close, its embrace like teeth locking together. They careened on the edge, and for a moment Kendra felt a flicker of doubt, tried to pull back. But the bony fingers held her wrist, unyielding as death. There was a meaty snap, and Kendra was too stunned even to scream as she fell in after it, slipping into the abyss. She hit against a dozen inclines and ledges in her descent, crashing and tumbling down until she came to an abrupt stop. She was in a shallow pool of water, so icy as to burn like fire. She gasped, sucking a frozen flood into her lungs. Flounderingly, she made her way to the surface, coughing and retching. Her mind buzzed vaguely as she tried to make sense of the darkness and the cold and the agony. Her wrist hurt like nothing she'd ever felt before. She could feel bone grating inside her. Crying out in anguish, she looked up. She could still see the light of the tunnel above. It was impossibly far, but even in her dazed state, she knew that now, in the garden, the impossible was more likely than she'd think. Panic became a spark of resolve in the darkness, and she rose trembling to her feet once more, even as the pain tore through her from every corner of her battered, broken body. Crouching, she readied herself to leap. There was a sound of a stomp and a crack, and her view of the world shook and collapsed to the side. Her ankle teetered beneath her and gave, flopping sickeningly as she fell back into water. She could see nothing, couldn't stand. Like a worm in the mud, she pushed her way to the side of the pool, her arm clutched to her chest, her foot sending surging bolts of pain through her each time it bumped against the rocky bottom. In that moment, Kendra felt less than a person, less than a beast, more wretched than the foulest vermin. A fragment of a thought passed through her mind. Sword. Moira's sword. Did she still have it? With an unyieldy twist, she set her left hand down to where it had been at her hip, and her fingers wrapped around the hilt of that stinging, awful blade. With a shout, she loosed it from its scabbard. "Stay back!" It came out more plea than threat. She swung it wildly, sightlessly, thrashing against the night. "Stay away from me!" She was not sure how long she lay in that frozen puddle of murky water, shivering, her breathing rapid and shallow. The rapier ached in her fist, metal singing hatefully, but she was not sure she could have loosened her grip even if she wanted to. Somehow, She suspected that the feel of that solid thing, painful as it was all that kept her from going mad with terror. Her heart pounded violently as her eyes flickered uselessly about. Where was it? Why had it not struck again? Did the steel truly have so much power over it? Quite unexpectedly, she found that she could see again. There was light now in the bottom of the rocky gully, illuminating the sharp edges of the broken stone, the dripping walls. She could see herself, too, see her limbs sticking out at unnatural angles, and she whimpered. Averting her eyes, she looked up and realized the source of the light. She was surrounded on all sides by translucent legions of specters. Kendra had not noticed the whispering return, but she heard it now, all around her, swelling like a wave. The figures were varied and many, tall and short, with strange clothes and shapes, and each to the last faceless. And hard though it was to pick any individual from the legion, she was convinced that she heard the voice of Moira and the voice of Thomas. Beyond words, she began to cry as they closed ranks around her. The whispering was overwhelming now, ringing in her head with a terrible clamor. They collapsed on her, sweeping past her meager resistance, falling over and through her, and she could feel herself drowning in them. The last thing Kendra saw before darkness fell, peering down at her through the shimmering masses of hopelessness and hate, was that twisted, stolen grin.